A dead man's ledger. A corrupt empire. One rider with nothing left to lose. Good man. Chapter 1. The saguaro anchored the deepest trough of the dry wash, thrusting thick ridged arms at the bleached sky like a man surrendering to a firing squad. John Good checked the roan gelding 50 yards up the slope. Noon heat baked the air into a shimmering jelly, distorting the shape pinned against the green spines into a dark pulsing smudge. It didn't belong. Too flat to be a roosting hawk. Lacking the bulk of a draped cat. He rested his palm on the saddle horn and waited for the thermal mirage to settle. It didn't. He touched his spurs to the horse's flanks, letting the animal pick its way down the loose shale. The sharp clatter of iron shoes on stone echoed flatly off the canyon walls. Good kept his right hand resting on his thigh, hovering inches from the stag horn grip of the colt. Not out of immediate alarm, but because that was the natural geometry of his arm when riding through empty country he didn't know. 20 yards out, the details resolved into terrible focus. Worn cavalry boots, the leather soles flapped and peeling. Canvas trousers stiffened with dark, crusted fluids that had nothing to do with trail dust. 10 yards out, Good pulled back on the reins. The execution possessed a grim, theatrical symmetry. The man hung from 6-inch iron spikes driven through his wrists, anchoring his weight into the fleshy core of the cactus. His arms canted upward, at an excruciating angle that made Good's own shoulders throb in sympathetic protest. His chin rested on a map of fresh lacerations and puckered, healed-over burns charting his bare chest. A heavy crust of black wax sealed the man's lips shut. Dead center on his sternum, a leather-bound ledger hung secured by a single railroad spike driven cleanly through the cover, parting the ribs, and burying itself deep into the saguaro wood. Good sat the horse, letting the tableau feed him the necessary information. An execution, obviously. A billboard left for the next rider passing through the wash. The immediate question was whether they expected him specifically, or if he was just the first unlucky soul to stumble into the exhibit. He swung down from the saddle. The caliche clay underfoot was baked hard as iron. No tracks remained, except the fresh crescents of his own horse, and a chaotic scuffing of earth leading away to the north. 5 horses, maybe 6. Unhurried. The man's fingers resembled bruised sausages, swollen and purple against the green needles. The blood tracking down his forearms had long since congealed into black ribbons. Good stepped close, placing the back of his knuckles against the man's jawline. Cold. Not the temporary chill of shade, but the deep, foundational cold of a body that had spent the night absorbing the desert's freezing exhalation. Good reached for the leather ledger. The man's eyes snapped open. Good's right hand cleared the colt from leather, freezing the muzzle leveled at the man's gut. The irises, staring back at him, swam in a jaundiced sea of yellow. They tracked Good's face, locking on. A deep, wet vibration rattled the man's ribcage, dying instantly against the thick seal of the wax. Sliding the colt back into the holster, Good palmed the heavy Bowie knife from his belt. The man flinched, a good sign. The nervous system still registered proximity. The pain receptors still fired. Good clamped his left hand over the man's forehead, tilting the skull back. The seal was a crude compound, paraffin heavily cut with soot and resin. Good worked the tip of the carbon steel blade under the edge at the corner of the mouth, applying steady leverage. The man drew rapid, whistling breaths through his nose. The wax gave way with a sharp crack. A chunk the size of a Morgan dollar popped loose, bouncing off the man's collarbone. He sucked a ragged lungful of air through the gap, sounding like a swimmer breaking the surface after too long under. Good rotated the blade, peeling the remaining seal away in 3 brittle strips. The lips beneath were raw meat, split and weeping. Water. The word emerged mangled, the tongue stumbling over the syllables. Good unslung his canteen, uncorked it, and tipped the rim against the bleeding mouth. The man swallowed greedily, fighting to pour the entire contents down his throat. Good let him take 3 heavy pulls before jerking the canteen away. "Pace yourself." The man's head dropped. The ledger nailed to his chest rode the erratic swell of his breathing. The iron spike had entered at a downward angle, severing the leather spine and fanning the dense handwritten pages outward. "Who did the carpentry?" Good asked. The yellowed eyes rolled up, assessing Good with a sudden, lucid calculation that entirely lacked gratitude. "The congregation," he rasped. "Salt River." The name meant nothing to Good. The territory crawled with fringe groups wrapping their larceny in scripture. "They left you for the buzzards." "They left me for you." The voice gained traction, smoothing out the rough edges. "They want the book found. Want it to pass hands." "Why?" "Because it infects whoever holds it. Makes them the new problem." Good studied the heavy iron spikes, the dried blood gluing the leather to the man's skin. He walked back to the roan, tied the reins to a scrub oak, and returned to the cactus. Extracting the spikes required 20 minutes of savage mechanical labor. Good locked his grip on the iron heads, twisting and working the metal against the dense, wet friction of the cactus core. The man didn't scream. He produced a sustained, hollow friction from the back of his throat, the sound of a mind retreating to some dark, unreachable corner while the body dismantled itself. When the left spike finally tore free, the arm dropped like dead timber, slapping against the spines with a wet tear of canvas and skin. Good moved to the right side. "Got a name to go with the suffering?" "Ezra." The head lolled back, fixing on the bleached sky. "Just Ezra. That covers it." Good worked the second nail. The cactus fibers groaned, gripping the rusted iron. Ezra's free hand shot out, locking onto Good's forearm with a sudden skeletal strength. "They feel it move," Ezra hissed. "When the book travels, they know. Books don't track. This one does." The final nail gave way. Ezra slid down the ribbed face of the saguaro, collapsing into the caliche dust. He curled onto his side, exposing a back that was infinitely worse than his chest. Someone had peeled the skin away in long, precise strips, packing the raw muscle with coarse salt before leaving him for the sun. Apache work, adopted and refined by white men with too much time and imagination. Good hauled Ezra upright. The man weighed nothing, a collection of hollow bones in a canvas sack. Good draped him face down across the saddle pommel, lashing his ruined wrists to the horn to keep him anchored. He left the ledger pinned to Ezra's chest. Pulling the spike now would likely open an artery they couldn't close. Taking the reins, Good started walking. The sun tilted past its apex, promising maybe 4 hours of usable light. 2 days ago, he'd passed a weathered line shack 15 miles to the south. The structure was derelict, but the stone well out back still drew cold water. As the roan plodded through the dust, Ezra talked. The narrative came in jagged bursts, punctuated by a wet, rattling cough that sounded like shifting gravel. "Started as a prayer circle," Ezra muttered, his chin bouncing against the saddle leather. 3 men looking for a quiet place to speak to God without federal interference. No taxes. No marshals. Just the land. Good kept his eyes on the horizon, measuring the distance against the dropping sun. "God packed his bags a long time ago," Ezra said. "Now, it's about the ledger. Every man they bought. Every territorial judge, sheriff, and land commissioner who took their coin and signed the deeds." "How many?" 47. Across 5 territories. Good stopped, the silence of the desert rushing in to fill the gap. "You're hauling a manifest of 47 corrupted officials." "I was." Ezra tilted his head, fixing one yellow eye on Good. Now you are. I'm just the transport. The book is still attached to you. They'll pry it off when they catch us. Then they'll bury you to cover the transaction. How far behind? Never more than a day. They let me set the pace, draw out the Good Samaritans. Anyone who picks up the ledger becomes a witness. They like their witnesses quiet. Good resumed walking, the leather of his boots scuffing a rhythm into the sand. Why you? I was the scribe. I managed the accounts. Then I caught a sudden crisis of conscience. Ezra produced a sound that might have been a laugh before it fractured into a wheeze. The severance package is steep. The line shack materialized from the heat haze a mile out, just as the dust plume broke the northern horizon. 3 miles back, a tight vertical column of pulverized dirt rising in the stagnant air. Riders pushing hard. Good hustled the roan the final stretch, pulling Ezra down and dragging him inside the shack. The interior smelled of pack rats and ancient wood rot. A rusted iron stove sat in the corner next to a sagging canvas cot. Good dumped Ezra onto the canvas and gripped the leather ledger. He yanked the spike free in one smooth, violent motion. Ezra's spine arched off the cot, his mouth opening in a silent, agonizing oval. The puncture wound over his sternum bubbled thick and black. Good examined the book. The leather remained warm, tacky with blood. He flipped it open. Dense, precise columns of names, dates, and cash amounts filled the lined paper. The immaculate handwriting of a professional clerk. He slapped the book shut, shoved it into his saddlebag, and stepped back to the warped doorframe. The dust column had resolved into 8 distinct riders. They charged across the flats with zero regard for formation, advertising their approach. Good turned back to the cot. Company's here. Ezra stared at the tin roof. Let them settle it. Not my style. We need a play. The board's closed, cowboy. There's the book, and there's the men who want it back. That's the whole game. Good scanned the shack's meager inventory. A splintered table. A wooden chair. A kerosene lantern resting on a crate of dry kindling. Nearest town? Redemption. 2 days' ride. Any law there worth a damn? Ezra coughed, spitting a dark speck onto his chin. The men who own Redemption are on page 12. Good leaned against the doorframe. The riders slowed, fanning out a quarter-mile away. 7 men hung back while the leader spurred a magnificent bay gelding forward. They wore crude flour sack hoods, the eyeholes hacked out with dull shears. Weekend vigilantes playing dress-up, but the rifles resting across their thighs looked impeccably maintained. The leader halted 40 feet from the porch. His hood was pristine, bleached white, lacking the trail dust of the others. Ezra. The voice was a heavy, grinding rasp, the sound of millstones crushing rock. Time to come home, prophet. Good stood in the doorway, letting his hands hang loose at his sides. The leader tilted his head, the dark eyeholes shifting to assess the new variable. Toss him out the door, friend. We'll let you ride the other way with your skin attached. Good cataloged the tactical spread. 8 men. Open ground. No cover between the shack and the horses. Men who executed people for a living didn't honor bargains. He stepped backward into the gloom. Ezra. Can your legs hold weight? Maybe. Find out. Good grabbed the kerosene lantern, unscrewing the cap. He kicked open the rusted door of the iron stove, shoving the kindling crate inside, followed by the splintered chair. He drenched the wood in kerosene, slung his saddlebag over his shoulder, and struck a match against the doorframe. Flames surged upward, licking the rusted stovepipe. Thick, oily smoke instantly flooded the small room, searching for the holes in the tin roof. Outside, the rasping voice called out again. Sharper this time. Good booted the front door, shattering the rusted hinges, and shoved Ezra toward the rear wall. The dry rot had eaten a massive gap where the floorboards met the foundation. Through the hole. Move. Ezra squeezed through the gap, dropping to the dirt outside with a sickening crunch. Good drew the Colt, stepped into the doorway, and fired a single round into the dirt 10 feet in front of the bay horse. The gelding danced, but the leader didn't flinch. Instead, the man reached into his saddlebag, extracting a thick stick of dynamite. The fuse was already capped and cut long. He struck a lucifer match against his saddle pommel, touching the flame to the cord. It hissed, spitting a stream of angry white sparks. The leader tossed it underhand. A lazy, perfectly calculated arc, like pitching a baseball to a toddler. The explosive hit the dust at the base of the steps and rolled over the threshold. Good spun, diving for the rear wall. He hit the gap, scraping his shoulders against the splintered wood, landed on top of Ezra, grabbed the man's canvas collar, and scrambled into the brush. The shock wave hit them a second later. The detonation pulverized the line shack, converting the timber and tin into a lethal expanding sphere of shrapnel. The concussive pressure slammed into Good's back, driving the breath from his lungs and launching him face first into the dirt. Somewhere in the chaos, the roan gelding shrieked, snapping its tether and vanishing into the scrub. Good hauled himself upright, his ears screaming with a high metallic whine. He dragged Ezra upright, throwing the man's arm over his shoulder, and plunged into the gathering dark. The new moon offered zero illumination. Good navigated by memory, feeling out the treacherous topography of Catclaw and unseen ravines. Ezra stumbled, his legs folding entirely. Good dragged him a dozen yards before the man simply anchored himself to the ground. "Drop me." "Keep moving." "I'm out of gas, cowboy." Good hoisted him by the belt. Behind them, the skeletal remains of the shack burned, casting a chaotic orange glow against the sky. Smaller, mobile lights began to detach from the inferno. Lanterns. The hunters spreading out. Good located the steep drop of an arroyo, perhaps the same network where he'd found Ezra hours earlier. He followed the sandy bottom northward, the 15-foot sandstone walls cutting off the wind and the ambient light. They staggered until the arroyo walls choked inward, terminating in a sheer crumbling rock face. A box canyon. Good lowered Ezra to the sand, leaning him against the cold sandstone. He checked the Colt. 5 rounds in the cylinder. The gentle clinking of bridle chains and the soft professional murmur of men working a trail echoed down the canyon. 5 lanterns appeared at the mouth of the arroyo, bobbing in the dark like floating embers. They halted 50 yards out, establishing a perimeter. The leader's grinding voice carried perfectly through the acoustic funnel of the rock walls. "You hit a wall, friend. We know the geology. You're sitting in a teacup." Good rested his forearms on his knees, thumbing the hammer of the Colt. "Take your time," the leader offered. "The prophet is running on fumes. We drained him pretty good before we left him. You're guarding a corpse and a book that just added your name to the index." Ezra's chest hitched. His eyes cracked open, the yellow spreading to the corners. "Sun comes up in 6 hours," the leader called out. "Walk out into the light. Leave the ledger. We're businessmen, not butchers." Good looked up the canyon walls. Vertical. Slick. Unclimbable without rope and daylight. "Think on it," the voice echoed. The lanterns settled onto the sand, 5 unblinking eyes holding the perimeter. Ezra's hand twitched, his fingers brushing Good's boot. "The ledger," Ezra whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves. "I have it. It's not the payroll that matters. It's the index of crimes. The things they authorized to secure the land. Ezra swallowed dryly. My testimony. My confession. It's all bound in that leather. You want it burned. I want it out of this territory. We're short on exits. A grotesque smile fractured the ruined skin around Ezra's mouth. You have an exit. You just have to drop the dead weight. Good watched the lanterns. Not tracking you. I'm cashing out, Ezra said. The wax, the salt, the exposure. My biology is already shutting down. By dawn, I'll be meat. Good leaned back against the sandstone. The chill bit through his shirt. Leave me, Ezra instructed. When they find the body, they'll see the spike hole. They'll know the book is gone. It makes you the primary target. I'm failing to see the upside. They won't linger to verify my pulse. They'll chase the ledger. You draw them off, lead them somewhere they hate. Where? Anywhere else. Good considered the math. 5 rounds. No mount. A dying accountant. A posse of territorial assassins sitting on a limitless supply of dynamite. Ezra. Yeah. You said this started as a prayer meeting. Ezra's eyes drifted shut. Long time ago. Put in a good word. Ezra produced that fractured, wheezing laugh one last time. Don't think the management is taking my calls, cowboy. I'll take my chances. The temperature plummeted as the hours ground past. Good sat in the pitch black, the Colt heavy across his thighs, watching the lanterns extinguish one by one to save oil. The leader's light was the last to die, plunging the canyon into absolute sensory deprivation. Good strained his hearing. The creak of saddle leather. The heavy breath of a resting horse. Then a new sound. Not from the canyon mouth, but directly overhead. The sharp clatter of a dislodged stone bouncing down the cliff face. Good tilted his head back. Against the faint canopy of stars, human silhouettes moved along the canyon rim. They had scaled the exterior slope, searching for a vantage point. One shadow separated from the group, leaning out over the precipice, peering straight down into the absolute dark of the canyon floor. Good held his breath, freezing his muscles. The silhouette lingered for an agonizing minute before pulling back, retreating along the rim. The faint crunch of boots on gravel faded. Beside him, Ezra released a long, shuddering sigh. The exhalation rattled in his throat, carrying on for several seconds before trailing off into total silence. Good reached out, pressing 2 fingers against the man's throat. The skin felt like cold parchment. No pulse. He sat beside the dead man for another hour, waiting. A sudden bloom of light at the canyon mouth broke the vigil. A single lantern, held low, illuminated the legs of the bay gelding. The leader walked his horse forward, stopping 50 feet away. The lantern, hanging from the saddle horn, projected his massive, distorted shadow against the sandstone walls. Ezra. Silence. I know you're lingering, prophet. Men don't die on schedule. They hold on. They hope. The horse shifted its weight, annoyed by the tension. You hoping, Ezra? The leader reached into his saddlebag, extracting a fresh cylinder of dynamite. He didn't light the fuse. He just rolled the wax paper between his fingers. Final offer. Send the book out. The cowboy walks. Good measured the distance. 50 feet. 5 rounds. The shot was viable, but the backup crew waiting in the dark wasn't. Clocks up, Ezra. Good stood, stepping into the edge of the lantern light. The leader's head snapped toward the movement. The dark eye holes locked onto Good. Well, look at that. The Good Samaritan. The rasping voice held genuine amusement. You know the survival rate for good men out here, friend. Good raised the Colt, locking his elbow. The leader laughed, the sound grinding against the stone walls. He struck a match against the saddle leather and touched it to the fuse. It hissed, bright and violent. He threw it. No lazy arc this time. A hard, flat trajectory, aimed directly at Good's boots. Good fired. The Colt kicked against his palm. The .45 caliber slug caught the spinning dynamite 10 feet out. The midair concussion bloomed into a blinding white sphere, the pressure wave slamming Good back into the sandstone. A cascade of ignited dust and pulverized rock washed over the canyon floor, and the bay gelding shrieked, bolting backward into the darkness. The lantern shattered. Acrid smoke choked the canyon, thick with the smell of sulfur and pulverized stone. Good pushed off the rock wall, a high-pitched whine drowning out all other sound. He dropped to his knees, blindly locating Ezra's body. He grabbed the heavy leather strap of the saddlebag, feeling the solid weight of the ledger inside. He didn't run toward the canyon mouth. He charged straight into the lingering smoke toward the rear wall. The explosion had radically altered the geography. A massive chunk of the sandstone cliff had fractured, collapsing into a steep, jagged slope of fresh rubble leading upward. Good climbed. He scrambled up the unstable scree, ignoring the sharp edges slicing through his leather gloves. The slope shifted beneath his boots, threatening to avalanche him back to the floor, but he clawed upward, using the saddlebag for balance. 10 feet to the rim. 5 feet. He lunged, hooking his fingers over the solid edge of the plateau, dragging his center of gravity over the lip. He collapsed onto the flat desert floor, gasping the dust from his lungs. Below him, the ringing faded, replaced by the frantic shouting of men rushing into the canyon. Lanterns flared back to life. Good crawled to the edge and looked down. The leader stood amidst the settling dust, his white hood scorched black on one side. He was screaming at his men, his arm thrust upward, pointing directly at the rim. Good pushed back from the edge. He had the ledger. He had a Colt with 4 rounds. No horse, no water, and a territory full of men perfectly willing to kill him over a book he didn't understand. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his jeans. The sky above was crystalline, the stars sharp and indifferent. He oriented himself westward, toward a town called Redemption that lay 2 days across hostile terrain. He adjusted the heavy saddlebag against his hip and started walking. He didn't look back. Chapter 2. He navigated the desert floor until the stars dissolved into a bruised, slate-gray dawn. The topography shifted beneath his boots, transitioning from loose sand to an unbroken pan of caliche. The chalky, sun-baked crust refused to hold a footprint, shattering under his heels like cheap porcelain. Good utilized the hardpan, recognizing that a man who leaves no trail buys himself the luxury of resting in the dark. When the sun finally crested the eastern ridges, the heat arrived not as a temperature, but as a crushing atmospheric weight. He sought refuge beneath the eroded lip of a sandstone butte. The overhang threw a wedge of deep, purple shade against the bedrock. Good dropped into the dirt, leaning his spine against the cool stone, and let the heavy leather saddlebag slide off his shoulder. He didn't open it immediately. He checked the Colt first. Flipping the loading gate, he rotated the cylinder. 4 rounds remaining. The ejector rod slid smoothly, the mechanism immaculate. A dirty weapon was a man's quiet admission that he didn't expect to survive the week. Snapping the gate shut, he pulled the ledger from the bag. The brown leather cover bore a complex, hand-tooled emblem, a sprawling oak tree whose root system tangled and mutated into a nest of vipers. He flipped past the ruined cover. Ezra's handwriting filled the lined pages with the meticulous, slanted precision of a man educated in a monastery or a federal penitentiary. The first entry dated back 3 years. A clandestine meeting at Salt River Station. Good read while the sun climbed, and the protective wedge of shade shrank to the width of his thigh. The names hit like physical blows. Territorial circuit judges, county sheriffs, federal land agents, a U.S. Marshal operating out of Yuma, a territorial senator, men who wore respectable wool suits and held the power to redraw maps and alter destinies with a stroke of a fountain pen. Beside each name sat a dollar amount, a date, and a cleanly summarized transaction. Favorable ruling in Territory versus Pima Land Co. Dismissal of trespassing indictments. Issuance of unrestricted water rights, Salt River Basin. Other entries lacked that bureaucratic sterility. Good snapped the book shut, on a page documenting the transfer of a widow's property following an unexplained fire. He understood exactly the payload he was hauling. It wasn't a ledger. It was a primed explosive wired to 47 distinct detonators. And somewhere behind him, the architect of that corruption was striking a match. He shoved the book back into the saddlebag and stood. The noon air blasted his face like the exhaust of an open furnace. Redemption lay 2 days away. He lacked a horse, water, and long-term prospects. He tracked a dry wash winding south through a series of low, undulating hills. The limestone walls of the cut offered sporadic relief from the glare. Thirst had moved past an annoyance and settled into a thick, dry swelling at the base of his tongue. He would either locate water or his biology would fail. Worrying about the sequence of events wouldn't generate a rain cloud. The wash flared outward, the walls dropping to knee height. A bay gelding stood broadside in the gravel 30 yards away. It was the leader's horse from the line shack. The reins trailed in the dust. Its head snapped up, ears swiveling forward to gauge Good's approach. A heavy canvas canteen hung from the saddle horn. A Winchester repeating rifle sat snug in the leather scabbard. Good approached with agonizing slowness, keeping his hands visible, projecting a low, meaningless hum of sound from his throat. The horse tracked him, muscles twitching, evaluating whether to trust a second master after the first had pushed it so relentlessly. It allowed him to gather the reins. The bay's coat felt slick and coarse with dried lather. Good uncorked the canteen, rinsing the dust from his mouth before swallowing a measured mouthful. He poured a cupful into the crown of his hat, letting the animal drink before evaluating the armory. The Winchester's action felt freshly oiled, the magazine tube fully loaded. He swung his leg over the saddle, feeling the immediate surge of elevation and advantage. He rode half a mile into the elevated limestone hills before spotting the dust. 2 distinct columns rising in the north, moving fast. 3 riders in the first formation, 4 in the second. The posse had splintered to drag the desert and was now converging. Good guided the bay into a dense cluster of ironwood scrub, letting the branches swallow their silhouette. They passed a quarter-mile to the west. The leader rode point. Without the flour sack hood, his face revealed the hard, predatory geometry of a scavenger. Close-set eyes anchored a narrow skull, bisected by a jagged white scar tracking from his left earlobe down to his jawline. The man rode with his head canted downward, reading the ground. The leader suddenly hauled back on the reins. He stared at the disturbed caliche where Good had crossed, then slowly lifted his gaze. He looked directly at the ironwood stand. He couldn't possibly see the bay through the dense brush, but he possessed the sheer instinct to feel the disruption in the landscape. Without looking back, the scarred man raised his right arm, rotating his index finger in a slow circle. The 6 riders fanned out instantly in a tactical pincer movement. Good wheeled the bay around. The gelding moved beautifully, stepping high over the deadfall with minimal noise. The hills funneled into a wide, alkali flat that offered zero concealment. Good rejected it, cutting hard to the north along a crumbling ridgeline. The shale here proved disastrously soft, the horse's iron shoes chewing deep, unmistakable gouges into the hillside. He checked his back trail. The 7 riders had hit the ridge, their horses fighting the incline. The scarred leader pointed at the fresh gouges. Good pushed the bay over the crest, dropping into a deeply carved canyon. The floor here was composed of shifting, bottomless sand that swallowed the horses' hooves to the fetlocks, slowing their pace to an agonizing crawl. A snapped tendon here meant death for the animal and the rider. A rifle shot cracked behind him, the sharp spang echoing wildly off the canyon walls. Not aimed. A sonic flare. They were announcing their proximity, attempting to induce panic. Good let the bay set its own laboring pace. The canyon meandered, cutting left, then right, before abruptly blooming into a wide, circular basin entirely walled in by sheer 50-foot cliffs. A box. A dead end. At the far edge of the bowl, a natural spring wept from a fissure in the rock, pooling into a shallow basin surrounded by vibrant green mesquite. Good dismounted, leading the exhausted bay to the water. He slipped the Winchester from the scabbard, checked the chamber, and slid it back. He drew the Colt, the staghorn grip familiar and solid against his palm. The first rider rounded the bend. He was incredibly young, his face violently sunburned and peeling in ragged sheets. Seeing Good standing by the spring, the kid hauled back on his reins, his right hand slapping down toward his holster. Good leveled the Colt. "Leave it." The kid's hand froze. His eyes darted from the muzzle of Good's weapon to the heavy saddlebag resting in the dirt. Relief and absolute terror fought a war on his blistering face. "Toss the iron," Good said. The kid unbuckled his rig, letting the heavy gun belt drop into the deep sand. "Step down." He slid off the saddle, raising both hands to his shoulders. "You're the guy from the shack. They said the dynamite cooked you. They miscalculated." The kid stared at the saddlebag. "You need to hand that over. It belongs to the preacher. Doesn't look like his handwriting." "I'm telling you," the kid's voice hitched. "He's the one who decides who lives and who goes in the ground." Good studied the peeling skin, the trembling hands. "How long you been playing vigilante?" 6 months. The kid swallowed hard. "I was farming outside Tucson. They said they needed capable men. Said there was deeded land in it for us. Building an empire on stolen acres." The kid didn't argue the point. "Get back on your horse," Good said, lowering the Colt slightly. "Ride out. Tell them you lost the trail. They'll shoot me." "They'll shoot you eventually anyway. A kid from Tucson doesn't fit the long-term corporate structure." Before the kid could process the out, the second rider broke the canyon bend. Older. Weathered. His flour sack hood remained pulled down, the eyeholes black voids. He took in the entire geometry of the basin in a microsecond, the disarmed kid, Good holding the Colt, the saddlebag by the spring. He bypassed his sidearm entirely, his hand diving toward the rifle boot on his saddle. Good squeezed the trigger. The Colt bucked. The slug caught the older rider high in the right shoulder, spinning him backward out of the saddle. He hit the sand hard but rolled violently, his left hand cross-drawing his revolver. Good fired again. The second round shattered the man's femur. The rider collapsed, his revolver discharging a useless geyser of sand. He lay pinned to the earth, his breath sawing out of his lungs in wet, ragged hitches. The young rider stood completely paralyzed, watching his horse bolt back down the canyon toward the pursuing posse. Good holstered the empty Colt and pulled the Winchester from the scabbard. He walked over to the bleeding man and kicked the revolver away. The rider's flour sack hood had twisted around, revealing a gray, sweat-slicked face rapidly losing its color. A massive, pulsing arterial bleed soaked the sand beneath his shattered leg. "You're a dead man," the rider gasped, his eyes struggling to focus on Good. "Looks like I've got company." "The preacher, he'll hunt you to the coastline for that ledger." "He can try." The older man produced a wet, bubbling cough. Blood flecked his lips. "It ain't about the cash. It's the authorization. The things he made us do to clear those claims. The judge won't let that see daylight." "The judge?" A morbid smile cracked the dying man's face. "You don't even know what you stole." "Coffee. Judge Elias Coffee. He built the whole machine. The preacher just pulls the triggers. The judge is the one who'll put you in the ground." His gaze drifted past Good, locking onto the paralyzed kid from Tucson. "Tell him," the older man whispered. "Tell Coffee we tried." The light vanished from his eyes, the mechanical function of his lungs ceasing entirely. Good checked the carotid artery. Nothing. He stood, jacking around into the Winchester's chamber. The young rider, Caleb, stared at the corpse. The terror in his eyes had solidified into a bleak, hollow resignation. "He was my cousin," Caleb said quietly. He drew first. "I know." Caleb dragged his gaze to the saddlebag. "What he said about Elias Coffee. It's the gospel truth. Coffee sits on the bench and runs the territory like a cartel. He's got the sheriff in redemption. The mayor. He's got a senator on the payroll. Where do I find him?" Caleb let out a short, humorless bark. "You don't. He finds you. You walk into redemption with that leather book. You're walking into an abattoir." Good listened to the canyon behind them. The remaining riders were out there, coordinating the approach. "Grab his horse," Good said, nodding toward the dead cousin's mount standing near the spring. "Ride out before the rest of them hit the bottleneck. They know my face. They know I was in this basin with you. Come with me then." Caleb looked at the spring, then at the brutal sheer walls of the box canyon. "He was a decent man before we signed on. My cousin. He's meat now. Mount up." Caleb walked to the horse. He gathered the reins and swung into the saddle. He looked down at Good, his peeling face cast in deep shadow by the midday sun. "My name's Caleb Webb. If you make it out of this territory, tell someone I wasn't cut out for the work." He spurred the horse, riding straight back toward the canyon mouth. Good watched the dust kick up behind him. He didn't try to stop the boy. A minute later, a rapid succession of 3 rifle cracks echoed down the narrow rock corridor. Then, the heavy, suffocating silence returned. Good mounted the bay. He rested the Winchester across the saddle horn, securing the ledger behind the cantle. He urged the gelding forward, tracing Caleb's path back toward the entrance. He rounded the sandstone bend and found the aftermath. Caleb Webb lay flat on his back, the front of his shirt destroyed by the close-range rifle volley. The posse had executed him and immediately withdrawn, leaving the body and the horse as a calculated psychological marker. Good dismounted. He retrieved Caleb's hat from the sand and placed it gently over the ruined, sunburned face. The bay gelding snorted, tossing its head and looking past Good down the length of the canyon. Good turned. At the far end of the wash, positioned perfectly in the center of the narrows, sat the preacher. He rode a massive dapple-gray stallion. The pristine white hood covered his face, the dark eye-holes offering nothing. A double-barreled shotgun rested horizontally across his saddle pommel, both hammers thumbed back. He hadn't followed Caleb down the canyon. He had flanked the basin and waited for the trap to spring. "You killed my man in the bowl," the grinding mechanical voice echoed off the rocks. Good kept his hands resting near the Winchester. He caught a bullet. Occupational hazard. The preacher shifted his left hand, digging into a small pouch on his belt. He tossed a braided rawhide strip into the dirt 10 feet from Good's boots. Compensation, the preacher said. Good didn't move. Pick it up. Good stepped forward, keeping his eyes locked on the shotgun. He scooped up the rawhide. Burned into the fresh leather was a name, John Good. Beneath it, a figure, $500. Coffee authorized the bounty this morning, the preacher explained. Cash on delivery. Head or the ledger, he doesn't care which. 500, Good said, testing the weight of the rawhide. Judge runs a cheap court. The preacher adjusted the scattergun, keeping the twin muzzles leveled at Good's sternum. Here's the wrinkle, the preacher said. I don't need Elias Coffey's money. So I'm offering you a window. Ride west. Hit the Colorado River and keep moving. Leave the ledger in the dirt. I'll tell the judge you bled out in the sand and the book burned. Why? The preacher tilted his head, the hood catching the harsh sunlight. Because the man you shot by the spring wasn't some farm kid from Tucson. He rode with me for 12 years. He pulled me out of the fire 3 times. The rasping voice deepened, shedding its professional detachment. Coffee wants your skull. I want you breathing. I want you to ride west and wake up every morning remembering what you left behind to save your own skin. Guilt eats a man slower than a bullet. Good looked at the rawhide strip, then back to the blank white canvas of the hood. The book stays in my saddlebag. It's going to get heavy. I'll manage the weight. The preacher held the standoff for 10 seconds. The desert amplified the silence, the heat pressing down on them both. You think you're the hero of this piece, the preacher finally said. The righteous man riding in to balance the scales. The grinding laugh returned. There is no balance. Just men with money, and men who dig the graves. I'm riding south to tell the judge you slipped the net. He'll deploy the professionals. Men who won't bother talking to you before they put a round through your spine from 1,000 yards. The preacher turned the gray stallion, exposing his back to Good, and began to ride away. Good brought the Winchester to his shoulder in a fluid, practiced motion. The steel butt plate nested perfectly. He aligned the front sight directly between the preacher's shoulder blades. The gray stallion paused. The preacher didn't look back. You won't pull it, he called out. You're burdened by rules. Men with rules don't shoot backs. I'm burdened by a book full of your sins. The preacher nudged the gray forward, dissolving into the heat shimmer down the canyon corridor. Good lowered the rifle. He secured it in the scabbard, collected the dead boy's horse, and mounted the bay. 2 horses. A freshly minted bounty on his head. An explosive piece of evidence. He rode south, tracking the preacher's route toward redemption. By late afternoon, the terrain leveled out into a sprawling, scrub-choked plain. The dust plume appeared an hour before sunset, a single rider approaching fast from the direction of the town. Good drew the Winchester, resting it across his thigh. The rider materialized. A young man, barely out of his teens, riding a lathered roan. He held a white flour sack aloft, waving it frantically like a flag of truce. He hauled the exhausted horse to a halt 50 feet out, his chest heaving. You good? Depends who's asking. The kid reached into his vest pocket, his movements exaggerated and slow. He produced a heavy, cream-colored envelope. Judge Coffey sent me. Said you require mandatory reading before you hit the city limits. Good extended his hand. The kid passed the envelope and backed his horse away. Good broke the wax seal. The handwriting inside possessed the elegant, flowing aggression of a man accustomed to absolute authority. "Mr. Good, I hold the girl from the saloon. She remains unharmed, contingent on your cooperation. Deliver the ledger to my chambers by noon tomorrow. Come alone. The alternative is severe. Judge Elias Coffey." Good folded the heavy parchment, tucking it into his shirt pocket. He looked at the messenger. "Tell Coffey I'm on the schedule." The kid nodded, wheeled the roan, and spurred it back toward Redemption. Good rode through the twilight, letting the horses set a methodical pace. The temperature plummeted, the desert rapidly shedding the day's heat. He navigated the gray ribbon of the trail under the cold light of a new moon, his mind turning over the mechanics of walking into a fortified town carrying the exact instrument of its destruction. Half a mile from the town limits, the silhouette of a horse blocked the road. Saddled, riderless. The preacher's massive dapple gray. Good approached cautiously, the Winchester raised. A bundle rested on the saddle pommel. It was the white flour sack hood, neatly folded. A wet, choking sound erupted from the irrigation ditch to his left. Good swung down from the bay, leveling the rifle at the darkness. In the ditch, the young messenger who had delivered Coffey's note knelt in the mud. His hands were lashed brutally behind his back with barbed wire. A thick hemp rope circled his neck, tethered tightly to a cedar fence post. A filthy rag gagged his mouth, his eyes wide and frantic in the starlight. Pinned to the boy's chest was a second piece of cream parchment. Good ripped it free. The elegant handwriting remained perfectly spaced. "You brought a farmer from Tucson into this affair. I do not tolerate external variables. Consider this my first objection. The girl will be the second." Good palmed his bowie knife, slicing the hemp rope and ripping the gag from the boy's mouth. "Run," Good ordered. "Head south. Don't stop for water until dawn." The kid scrambled up the embankment, tearing into the darkness without a word. Suddenly, the gray stallion spooked, bolting down the road toward the town. Good tracked its flight, looking toward the gates of Redemption. At the town's entrance, a massive wooden post had been erected. Someone had stretched a white flour sack hood over the top and set a kerosene fire blazing beneath it. The leaping flames illuminated the main thoroughfare. 50 yards beyond the burning effigy, a young woman stood lashed to a hitching post in front of the local saloon. Her hands were drawn painfully tight above her head. Stacked meticulously around her ankles, reaching halfway to her knees, were dozens of split pine logs. Judge Coffey's second objection was fully assembled and waiting for a match. Good chambered around in the Winchester and began the long walk toward the light. Chapter 3. The flaming effigy collapsed into a pile of glowing orange slag as Good walked past the town perimeter. The stink of scorched flour sack and raw kerosene hung heavy in the stagnant air, coating the back of his throat. Redemption consisted of a single, wide thoroughfare lined with peeling false fronts. A livery stable, a general store, a hotel with a sweeping porch where unoccupied rocking chairs sat dead still in the breathless heat. At the far southern terminus of the street sat a 2-story structure bearing a faded gold-leaf sign, "The Last Chance." The girl was anchored to a weathered hitching post directly beneath the saloon's second-floor balcony. Good walked the center of the hardpack, his boots grinding a steady, solitary rhythm. The buildings flanking him were entirely blacked out. The only illumination bled from the saloon's yellow, open doorway. He halted 10 feet from the post. The ropework securing her was professional, lashing her wrists painfully high. Beneath her boots, the split pine kindling had been stacked with a geometric, suffocating precision. She was barely out of her teens, possessing the kind of dark, striking features that looked soft until you noticed the rigid, unforgiving set of her jaw. She watched him close the distance. They laid heavy odds. You were already riding for the border. I missed the turn. Her gaze dropped to the heavy leather saddlebag slung over his shoulder. She lingered on it before bringing her eyes back to his face. The entire peril is inside. The judge, the county sheriff, the mayor. 24 shooters. Anybody in a good mood. She glanced down at the dry pine stacked against her shins. They think that ledger is a cancer. They say it's a list of every man who took a bribe to secure this valley. If it reaches a federal desk, Elias Coffey loses the town, the water rights, and the grazing land. You disagree. The hardness in her face fractured, revealing a sharp, polished rage beneath. Coffey doesn't lose anything. Other people lose things. My father ran a legitimate claim north of here. Coffey offered to buy the water rights. My father declined. A week later, he caught a bullet in his own field. I don't even have a grave to visit. Good studied the open double doors of the saloon. The yellow light spilling onto the dirt remained static. No shadows crossed the threshold. Coffey is holding court, she said. He wants you to walk through those doors and hand over his liabilities. Good slipped his Bowie knife from its sheath and stepped toward the hitching post. Don't, she hissed, her body tensing. He froze. You sever that rope. The sheriff steps out with a scattergun and cuts you in half, she warned. They secure the ledger, drag my ass back to this post and strike the match themselves. Walk inside. Negotiate. Give Coffey the paper. He put a $500 bounty on my skull. That limits my negotiating posture. He's terrified of that book. He kept Ezra breathing for a month, just to see who had the nerve to pry it off him. He's evaluating you. Good slid the heavy blade back into its leather sheath. The saddlebag dragged at his shoulder, dense with the weight of Ezra's meticulous accounting. What's your name? Maria. No last name? Just Maria. It wasn't the time for a smile, but Good almost managed one. A girl tied to a pyre, in a town run by assassins, maintaining her operational security to the bitter end. I'm going inside, he said. If the acoustics get loud, work your wrists free. There's a skinning knife in the left pocket of the bay's saddle. Take the bay. Leave the gray alone. It belongs to a man who would strike the match himself. He turned his back on the kindling and walked up the 3 wooden steps, pushing through the batwing doors. The Last Chance possessed the dimensions of a high-end slaughterhouse. A massive mahogany bar dominated the left wall, backed by an imported mirror that reflected the tense, crowded room. The air was a suffocating miasma of stale cigar smoke, unwashed wool, and the sharp acetone bite of cheap rye whiskey. He tallied 22 men. The sheriff leaned against the mahogany, a tarnished silver star pinned to his vest, a heavy shot glass cradled in his palm. The mayor occupied a small table near the rear staircase, his hands trembling visibly beneath a ridiculous chain of office. The remaining 20 were a mixed bag of hired muscle, some wearing tailored broadcloth, others in trail-dusted canvas. Every man in the room was armed. Several held repeating rifles resting casually across their thighs. No one drew. They simply watched him walk the length of the floor. At the extreme rear of the room, seated behind a wide poker table shoved flush against the wall, was Judge Elias Coffey. Coffey possessed a massive, soft architecture. Broad shoulders sloping into a thick, fleshy torso, clad in an unbuttoned black suit. His face was surprisingly smooth, the pale, untroubled skin of a man who managed violence exclusively from behind a desk. His white hair was slicked back with heavy oil. He was carving a thick, bleeding steak. Coffey sheared off a piece of the beef, placed it in his mouth, and chewed methodically, never breaking eye contact with Good. The batwing doors swung shut, the squeak of the hinges deafening in the absolute silence of the room. Coffee swallowed, took a measured sip from a crystal glass of dark red wine, and patted his lips with a linen napkin. "Mr. Good," the judge boomed. It was a rich, theatrical baritone, designed to bounce off the vaulted ceilings of a courtroom. "I was beginning to doubt your punctuality. Ran into some detours." Coffee's eyes flicked to the leather bag. "You've navigated quite a gauntlet. The line shack. The canyon. I must offer my condolences regarding the young Webb boy. Caleb was an idiot, but he was a largely harmless idiot. He was a farmer from Tucson looking for a deed. He swore an oath to the congregation and broke it." Coffee sliced another ribbon of beef. "Oaths carry weight in my jurisdiction, Mr. Good. So does tying a woman to a pile of firewood." Coffee offered a magnanimous, entirely artificial smile. "Maria has been a guest of the municipality. Room, board, hydration. She remains completely unharmed. A status I am eager to maintain, provided we reach a mutually beneficial understanding." Good unslung the heavy bag, holding it by the leather strap. The room's atmospheric pressure instantly spiked. The sheriff placed his shot glass on the bar. "I'm listening." Coffee rested his forearms on the green baize of the poker table. "You recovered a ledger. A collection of fever dreams, scrawled by a former employee suffering from a profound mental collapse. Ezra possessed a vivid imagination. He convinced himself he was a prophet, mandated to expose a vast phantom conspiracy. He had dates, bank routing numbers, favorable rulings purchased with cash. He had a talent for creative fiction." Coffee's smile held its rigid shape. "I have civilized this territory for 23 years. I have adjudicated water rights and property lines. I have sent men to the gallows and men back to their families. The assertion that I run a criminal syndicate is libelous nonsense. Then you don't mind if I keep it as a souvenir." The warmth vanished from Coffee's pale face. "I require it destroyed. It is a slanderous document that, if circulated, could cause good citizens to doubt their civic institutions. I spent my life building a legal framework in a desert that had none. I will not permit a lunatic's diary to dismantle that architecture." He extended a soft, perfectly manicured hand across the table. "Pass the bag, Mr. Good. I'll order the girl cut down immediately. You'll receive fresh mounts, provisions, and enough gold to purchase a coastal property in California. You ride out tonight. Zero pursuit." Good looked at the manicured fingers. Fingers that had never blistered on a shovel handle or chambered a rifle round under fire. "The book stays with me." Coffee's hand hung suspended in the smoky air for 3 seconds before slowly retracting. "You failed to grasp the mechanics of the territory," Coffee said softly. "You think you can ride west, drop that ledger on a newspaper editor's desk, and watch the federal marshals sweep in to arrest the bad men." Coffee picked up his wine, swirling the dark liquid. 20 years ago, this valley was an abattoir. Apaches, border renegades, and claim jumpers slaughtering families for 100 acres of scrub brush. Total bloody chaos. We tamed it. We brought the courts. Yes, we brokered ugly deals with violent men. We compromised. But we built a society that will outlast us all. That ledger is merely the itemized receipt for civilization." He leaned forward, the wooden chair groaning under his bulk. "You publish those names, and this town tears itself apart. The federal government strips our autonomy. The marshals lock up the men who actually keep the peace, and the Apaches and the squatters flood right back in. You want to plunge this valley back into the dark ages over some misplaced morality. I want the girl cut loose. When the leather bag sits on this table, cut her loose, let her walk to the edge of town, and we'll discuss the real estate. Coffee tapped his index finger against the linen napkin. Once. Twice. Sheriff. The lawman pushed off the mahogany bar, his spurs ringing as he crossed the floor. He pushed through the batwing doors. Good watched through the slatted wood as the sheriff drew a pocket knife, severing the heavy hemp rope. Maria's arms dropped. She rubbed her wrists, staring into the dark street, before turning her attention back to the saloon. The sheriff stepped back inside. She's loose. Coffee nodded, shifting his gaze to Good. We've honored our end of the transaction. Good tightened his grip on the saddlebag strap. The dead weight of 47 corrupted officials hung heavy against his knuckles. He took a slow, deliberate step toward the poker table. The 20 hired guns against the walls tightened their grips on their weapons. The metallic click of a hammer being cocked back sounded unnervingly loud. Good was 10 feet from the judge when the batwing doors slapped open behind him. He didn't pivot. The sharp, rapid impact of boot heels on the floorboards told him everything. Maria marched straight down the center aisle of the saloon, ignoring the bristling armory surrounding her. She stopped adjacent to Good, glaring across the green baize at Elias Coffee. Maria, Coffee said, his voice tightening, I suggest you take the opportunity you were just handed. She didn't blink. Don't hand him the ledger, she said, her voice carrying clear to the back walls. Maria, step back from the table. I was locked in the room directly above this one all night, she continued, her eyes burning into the judge. They aren't worried about maintaining civilization. They're terrified the book lands on a desk that isn't already on their payroll. Someone who will take those pages to the Capitol and hang them all for murder. Coffee's fingers dug into the edge of the poker table. Remove her. She stepped closer, slamming her bruised palms onto the table, rattling Coffee's wine glass. My father's name is in that book. Page 37. I know, because the preacher bragged about it while he was tying me to the post. Web claim. Acquired. Occupant, deceased. 3 lines of ink to justify putting a bullet in a farmer's spine. Coffee's face flushed a deep, mottled crimson. The diplomatic veneer shattered entirely. I ordered you to step away. Good let the saddlebag slip from his fingers. It hit the floorboards with a heavy, dead slap. He didn't reach for his Colt. Instead, he plunged his hand into the open flap of the bag, extracting the brown leather ledger. The room instantly contracted. Rifle snapped to shoulders. The sheriff cleared his revolver from its holster, leveling it at Good's spine. Good hoisted the book high, the gold-tooled serpents catching the ambient light. 47 names, Good projected, his voice slicing through the tension. Your sheriff. Your mayor. The men who took your bribes to look the other way while you burned families out of their homes. Coffee's breath hitched. Put it on the table. I'm walking out of here with the girl, Good stated. And I'm riding straight to the federal marshal operating out of Tucson. Coffee let out a sudden, booming laugh. It lacked all humor, sounding like a dog barking in a cavern. You think you can navigate past 22 guns? And even if you sprout wings, the Tucson marshal is irrelevant. Is he? Good lowered the book. Page 41 explicitly lists the officials who refused your coin. Your enemies of the court. The men Ezra flagged as the only clean badges left in the territory. The Tucson marshal is at the top of the list. He's been waiting 3 years for the connective tissue to indict you. The blood completely drained from Coffee's face, leaving the skin a sickly translucent white. "You're bluffing. You didn't read that far." "I read enough to know precisely where to deliver the payload." Coffee lunged. The massive man moved with shocking, desperate speed, propelling his bulk across the poker table. His manicured hands clamped onto the leather cover of the ledger, yanking violently. Good ripped the book backward. The aged, dry-rotted binding failed. A single page tore loose with a sharp rip, remaining clutched in Coffee's fist. The judge stared at the single sheet of paper. His eyes scanned the names, the numbers, the undeniable physical proof of his criminality hanging in his hand. The reality of his crumbling empire hit him like a physical blow. He crumpled the paper, crushing it into a tight, damp ball. His head snapped up, his eyes feral. "Kill him." Good dropped. He kicked the edge of the heavy poker table, launching it upward into Coffee's midsection as a hurricane of lead shredded the air where he had just been standing. The saloon detonated. The massive mirror behind the bar exploded into 1,000 glittering razors, showering the sheriff in glass. Bottles ruptured, spraying the air with vaporized alcohol. The concussive roar of 20 guns firing simultaneously in an enclosed space was a physical pressure that crushed Good's eardrums. He hit the floorboards, grabbing Maria's ankle, dragging her beneath the minimal cover of the overturned table. Bullets chewed through the mahogany, raining splinters over their heads. "Crawl!" Good roared over the din. They scrambled like rats through a maze of shattered chairs and stomping boots. The hired guns were firing blindly through the blinding white smoke of black powder, catching their own men in the crossfire. The mayor took a stray round to the collarbone and went down screaming. Good reached the batwing doors, shoving Maria through the splintered wood. They spilled onto the porch, inhaling the blessed cool night air. The bay and the gray stood ground-tied in the dirt, tossing their heads in panic at the gunfire. Good grabbed the horn of the bay, vaulting Maria into the saddle. He didn't bother finding the stirrup, lunging up behind her, wrapping one arm around her waist, and grabbing the reins of the gray with his free hand. The saloon doors blew outward, the sheriff plunging onto the porch with a leveled scattergun. Good spurred the bay savagely. The horse launched forward just as the shotgun boomed, the heavy buckshot stripping the bark off the wooden awning post inches from Good's skull. "Ride!" Good yelled. They tore down the center of the street, the lead gray galloping furiously alongside them. Behind them, men poured out of the last chance, their muzzles flashing orange against the dark. The sharp cracks of Winchester fire chased them, kicking up plumes of dirt around the horses' hooves. Coffee's voice pierced the chaos, a high, thin shriek of absolute panic. "Get the ledger. Don't let him reach the desert." They blew past the smoldering remains of the flour sack effigy, hitting the open trail. The moon hung low and heavy, casting the sprawling desert into an ocean of black and silver. Good didn't pull back on the reins until the lights of redemption vanished entirely behind a high, jagged ridge. The horses were lathered, their breathing wet and ragged in the cold air. He slowed them to a walk, his lungs burning. Maria sat rigidly in front of him, her hands locked onto the saddle horn. "How much distance to Tucson?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. 3 hard days." "Can we outrun Coffee's payroll?" Good checked his back trail. The road was currently empty, but Coffee had the resources to mobilize a cavalry unit by sunrise. "We outrun them, or we die in the sand. Those are the available options." She twisted in the saddle, the moonlight catching the harsh angles of her face. Page 37. "You said you read it." Good tapped his chest. He had shoved the ledger into his shirt during the scramble under the table. He could feel the heavy vellum pressing against his ribs. "I read it." "Was it 3 lines of ink?" He pictured Ezra's flawless, slanted handwriting. The clinical efficiency of the transaction. It was 3 lines. $1,200 paid to the sheriff. She nodded once, facing forward. She didn't cry. She just absorbed the accounting of her father's life and filed it away. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion. They rode for another hour in total silence, the temperature dropping steadily. The horses needed water, and they needed to rest before they snapped a leg in the dark. Good spotted the steep cut of a dry wash, bisecting the plain. The high limestone banks would provide cover from the wind and obscure their silhouette from the road above. He dismounted, leading the bay and the gray down the precarious sandy slope. The bottom of the wash was choked with dead catclaw, but the air smelled faintly of damp earth. He found a minor seep weeping from the bedrock, pooling in a shallow stone basin. He let the horses drink first, then filled his hat and handed it up to Maria. She drank greedily, wiping her mouth with the back of her bruised wrist. She stared down at him. "When you find this, Marshal, what happens to the sheriff who took the 1,200? He faces a federal judge. If the paper trail holds, he hangs." "And coffee?" "Same rope, different knot." She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the pommel. "That's why you're risking a bullet. You think that book is a courtroom. It's the best weapon we've got." They fell quiet. The horses cropped at the sparse, wiry grass growing near the seep. The wind howled softly over the lip of the wash, masking the ambient noise of the desert. Which was why Good didn't hear the approach until it was directly above them. The soft, metallic clink of a spur against stone. Good threw his hand over the bay's muzzle, clamping it shut to prevent a whinny. He froze, his right hand hovering over the stag grip of the colt. A shadow eclipsed the stars at the top of the embankment. "I can smell the water, friend." The grinding, mechanical voice drifted down into the wash. "The preacher. And I can smell the horses." Good gripped Maria's thigh, squeezing hard. "Don't move." "I'm offering the window one final time," the preacher called out, his silhouette completely still against the sky. "Leave the ledger in the sand. Leave the girl. Walk west until you hit the river. I tell Coffee you bled out." Good silently unholstered the Colt. The angle was terrible. The preacher held the high ground, wrapped in total darkness. "I'm going to count to 3, the preacher stated. The calm in his voice was terrifying. 1. Good grabbed Maria's arm, hauling her out of the saddle. He dragged her toward the steepest section of the bank, desperate for the minimal overhang it provided. 2. Good shoved her against the dirt wall, shielding her body with his own. The sharp, sulphurous hiss of a struck match echoed loudly. A bright, sparking fuse illuminated the preacher's white flour sack hood for a fraction of a second. "Sorry it played out this way," the preacher said softly. He tossed the explosive over the edge. Good watched the sparking fuse arc through the black air. It hit the sandy bottom of the wash and rolled directly between the legs of the bay gelding. "Down!" Good roared, burying his face into Maria's shoulder. The wash erupted. A blinding sphere of kinetic energy and white fire expanded instantly, vaporizing the silence. The concussive wave picked Good up and slammed him violently against the limestone wall, driving the oxygen from his lungs and fracturing the world into a chaotic spray of blood, sand, and agonizing noise. Good man. Chapter 4. The world returned as a mouthful of pulverized limestone and the taste of copper. Good lay flat against the earth, waiting for the violent spin of the desert floor to stabilize. The dynamite had scrambled his inner ear, replacing the ambient noise of the wind with a high, shrieking, metallic whine that drilled directly into his skull. Beneath that phantom frequency, the real sounds began to bleed through, the frantic scraping of boots on gravel, and the distant rhythmic thud of horses being spurred hard. He pushed himself up onto his elbows. The ground listed violently to the left. He locked his muscles and waited for gravity to reassert its proper angle. Maria was 10 feet away, on her hands and knees in the settling dust. Her dark hair was caked white with crushed caliche, the shoulder of her cotton dress ripped to the seam. She was violently shaking, her lungs hitching as she fought for oxygen in the smoke-choked air. "Bones intact?" Good asked, his own voice sounding like it was coming through a wall of water. She lifted her head, her face a ghostly mask of dust streaked with fresh blood from a scalp laceration. "I can't hear you." "It fades," he said, reading her lips more than hearing his own volume. He surveyed the wash. The detonation had transformed the steep, protective embankment into a smoking crater of collapsed rock and uprooted catclaw. The seep was buried under a ton of debris. The bay and the gray were gone, having bolted the instant the shockwave hit. The preacher was gone too, but not far. Looking east, Good spotted the methodical sweep of 5 lanterns bobbing along the upper road. The search line. The preacher rode point, the white flour sack hood floating like a pale detached moon above the scrub. They were moving at a calculated crawl. The posse knew they had vaporized the horses and the water supply. They knew the terrain offered zero concealment for 5 miles in any direction except the jagged limestone hills to the south. Good forced himself upright. His legs felt like they belonged to a stranger, but the joints held. He hauled Maria to her feet. "Can you run?" "Watch me." They moved south, plunging into the dark. The sand here was deep and unforgiving, sucking at their boots and demanding a massive expenditure of caloric energy for every yard gained. The new moon offered no illumination, turning the desert into a pitch-black obstacle course of razor-edged agave and unseen ravines. Every step they took snapped dry brush, a sound Good knew would carry for miles on the cooling night air. He couldn't do anything about the noise or the tracks. They had no cover. They just had the dark and the distance. An hour blurred into a grueling, hypoxic slog. The line of lanterns on the upper road paced them perfectly, a slow, unblinking pendulum sweeping back and forth. The preacher was letting the desert do the heavy lifting, waiting for the terrain to grind them down to the bone. Maria's stride deteriorated. Her breathing turned into a wet, ragged saw, but she didn't ask to stop. She just kept throwing one bruised leg in front of the other. The jagged silhouette of the hills loomed closer. 2 miles. The deep, rhythmic drumming of approaching hooves rolled out of the east. Fast. No lanterns. Good grabbed Maria's torn shoulder, dragging her down into the dirt behind a sprawling cluster of creosote. They flattened themselves against the cold sand. 3 riders tore past 100 yards to the north, their dark shapes eclipsing the stars. Hard men riding with the aggressive confidence of locals who knew every blind drop and arroyo in the basin. The riders intersected the preacher's lantern line. A brief pause. Muffled, authoritative voices carried on the wind. Then all 8 lanterns pivoted directly south. They had the scent. Good hauled Maria up. "Move." They sprinted. The ground turned treacherous, the soft sand giving way to a jagged incline of loose shale and chala cactus. Maria caught her toe on an exposed root and went down hard, tearing the skin from her palms. Good hauled her upright by the belt, practically carrying her as she scrambled for purchase. The base of the hills rose up like a fortress wall. "Up the slope," Good ordered. The incline was brutal, a 50-degree pitch of crumbling limestone that sheared away beneath their boots. Good pushed her from behind, letting her find the handholds, absorbing the shower of sharp gravel she kicked loose. At the base of the hill, The lanterns converged. They hit the slope. The preacher's grinding voice echoed upward, unnervingly calm. Flank the ridge. Don't let them crest. Maria climbed with the frantic, clawing desperation of a cornered animal. They hit the narrow apex of the ridge, the wind cutting sharply across the exposed rock. The far side didn't slope. It dropped off into a labyrinthine canyon system, 50 feet of near-vertical shadowed drop. A fall meant shattered femurs and a slow death. The metallic clink of spurs rang out on the limestone directly below them. "We go down," Good said, gripping her arm. "Do not stop. Do not look up." Maria didn't hesitate. She went over the lip, dropping into the abyss with a terrifying, fluid grace. She trusted holes that Good couldn't even see, sliding down the treacherous chimney of rock like water over a spillway. Good followed, vastly heavier and less agile. His boots slipped on a patch of loose scree, dropping him 10 feet before he slammed his forearms into a narrow fissure, tearing the leather from his gloves to break his momentum. He hit the sandy floor of the canyon a second after Maria, drawing the Colt and scanning the absolute blackness. Empty. They bolted down the winding corridor of rock. The canyon walls squeezed inward, twisting blindly before flaring out into a wide gravel-choked basin. Good spotted a deep, recessed overhang, carved into the far wall by centuries of flash floods. He shoved Maria into the deep pocket of shadow and collapsed beside her. They sat in total silence, waiting for the sound of pursuing hooves. The canyon offered nothing but the wind whistling through the limestone flutes. They had slipped the noose. Temporarily. Maria leaned her head back against the cold stone, her chest heaving. "The ledger," she gasped. "You still have it." Good touched the heavy strap, cutting into his collarbone. He hadn't realized he was still wearing it. "I have it." She closed her eyes, her pale dust-caked face looking like a death mask in the starlight. "They aren't going to quit." Coffee. The preacher. "They'll hunt that paper until we're both bleeding out in the scrub." "I'm aware of the forecast." "Leave it," she whispered. "Bury it under the rocks here. Let them find it. Let them have the valley. We walk away." Good unslung the bag, letting it rest on the gravel between them. 47 men took a paycheck to execute farmers and redraw the map. "Your father is in the index. You want me to bury the receipt." "My father is rotting in an unmarked hole. Exposing Elias Coffee won't dig him up." "No. But it stops Coffee from filling the next hole." She opened her eyes, studying his face in the gloom. The rigid anger that had sustained her in the saloon was bleeding away, replaced by the crushing gravity of their situation. "You actually believe that," she said. "A man has to anchor himself to something." A bitter, fractured smile touched the corner of her mouth. "My father sold me that exact line. When we crossed the border. When we staked the claim on the Salt River. He said the law was a shield. He believed the paper deed in his lockbox actually meant something to the men with the guns." She stared at the saddlebag. He anchored himself right into the grave. Good ran his thumb over the cracked leather of the bag. "I'm not your father." "No," she agreed quietly. "You're not." The temperature plummeted further. The desert silence settled heavily around them, broken only by the settling of cooling rock. Good flipped the flap of the bag and pulled the ledger out. The cover hung loose, the pages warped by sweat and the dampness of Ezra's blood. He thumbed it open to page 37. Web claim, Salt River. Acquired. Occupant, deceased. Paid, $1,200 to Sheriff T. Crane. Disposition. Transferred to Congregation Holdings, Section 14. "What does the entry say?" she asked, watching his eyes track the ink. Your father's acreage was absorbed by the congregation. They handed Sheriff Crane $1,200 in cash to oversee the transition. She nodded slowly. I knew it. Crane was standing right there, behind the preacher's horse. He watched my father bleed into the dirt and didn't touch his weapon. He's in the book. Page 37. When you find your federal marshal in Tucson, she said, her voice dropping to a hollow whisper, what happens to a sheriff who takes $1,000 to watch a murder? He stands in front of a jury. Then he stands on a trapdoor. The hollow resignation vanished from her eyes, replaced by a cold, pilot-light intensity. She reached out, her bleeding fingers resting gently on the leather cover. He would have liked you, she said softly. My father. He would have called you a good man. I'm just the courier. She pulled her hand back. We need altitude. Before the sun breaks. The posse will sweep this grid at first light. Good scanned the canyon. To the west, a narrow, treacherous game trail zigzagged up a fissure in the rock wall, leading toward the flat expanse of the upper mesa. Up we go. They climbed, as the sky bruised into a dull pre-dawn purple. By the time they hauled themselves over the final lip onto the sprawling mesa, the sun breached the horizon, instantly striking the flatland like a hammer hitting an anvil. The mesa offered zero shade. Just miles of sun-baked hardpan, dotted with stunted skeletal mesquite bushes. They walked. Within 2 hours, the heat became a physical adversary, pressing down on their shoulders, sucking the moisture from their eyes and lungs. Maria's pace staggered. She swayed, her lips cracking and bleeding in the dry furnace wind. Good pulled his wide-brimmed Stetson off and shoved it down over her dark hair. She didn't have the energy to protest. He scanned the horizon. To the west, a hazy blue spine of mountains marked the distance to Tucson. 3 days of walking. Without water, their biology would shut down in 6 hours. He looked at the heavy saddlebag. He was rapidly approaching the intersection where he had to choose between hauling the evidence or keeping the girl upright. A sharp, shrill whinny shattered the silence. Good stopped dead, his hand dropping to the Colt. 100 yards ahead, standing perfectly still at the very edge of the mesa, was the preacher's massive dapple-gray stallion. Fully tacked. Riderless. It stood at the head of a switchback trail, leading down into a deep, hidden gorge. The animal tossed its massive head, stamping a hoof against the hardpan. It smelled water. Good approached cautiously, grabbing the trailing leather reins. The gray didn't spook. Its flanks were heaving, slick with dried sweat. It had run a massive, terrified arc through the night, before letting its survival instincts guide it to the nearest source of hydration. Take the leather, Good told Maria, handing her the reins. Walk him down. I'll cover the rear. They descended into the gorge. The temperature dropped 10 degrees the moment they dipped below the rim. The canyon floor was a lush, impossible shock of green cottonwoods and thick mesquite, clustered around a deep, crystal-clear spring welling from the bedrock. Maria led the gray to the water. The animal drank in heavy, rhythmic pulls. She dropped to her knees beside it, plunging her face into the cold basin. Good knelt, drinking until his stomach ached, then splashed the freezing water over his neck and face. He leaned his spine against the damp, mossy rock wall, letting his muscles completely unspool for the first time in 24 hours. Maria sat beside him, pulling her knees to her chest. How long? Until the preacher cuts our sign, Good said, his eyes closed. He's a professional. He'll find the horse's tracks eventually. Probably before dusk. They didn't discuss a plan, because one didn't exist. They were trapped in a bowl with a single exit, guarding an explosive document with 4 bullets and a stolen horse. Good let the profound exhaustion drag him under. He slept. The sharp clatter of falling rock snapped him awake. Good was on his feet, the Colt leveled before his conscious brain fully engaged. Maria was already standing, the oversized Stetson pushed back on her head, staring up at the western rim of the gorge. The preacher sat his horse 50 feet above them, looking down. The white flour sack hood caught the blinding midday sun. He held the high ground, perfectly silhouetted against the blue sky. To his left and right, 4 other riders from the posse sat their mounts, Winchester rifles resting across their pommels. The gray stallion, standing in the spring, lifted its head, whinnying at the sight of its master. The preacher's grinding voice floated down into the bowl. "You located my transportation." Good kept the Colt pointed at the dirt. "He's a smart animal," the preacher noted. "Knows the territory. Knows how to find the water when the map goes blank." The preacher shifted his weight, crossing his wrists over his saddle horn. "You're out of real estate, Good. The trail ends here. Pass the ledger up." Good looked at Maria. Her face was locked in a mask of absolute defiance. "The girl walks," the preacher offered. "She takes the gray. Rides back to redemption. Coffee gave his word she won't be touched. Coffee's word is worth about as much as a brass penny." The preacher's head tilted. "You think I'm running a bluff. You think Coffee wants her in the dirt. I think Coffee wants the book. Whatever bodies he has to stack to get it is just overhead." The preacher went completely still. Even the horse beneath him stopped shifting. "You're exactly right," the preacher said, his voice dropping the theatrical rasp. "Coffee wants the book more than he wants oxygen. Because without that leather binding, Elias Coffee is just a fat, sweating old man in a tailored suit. That ledger is the only thing on this earth that can strip his empire." The preacher leaned forward, the white hood dipping. "Toss it up. I'll let you both ride west. I'll supply the mounts. You vanish into California. I'll report to Coffee that you caught a bullet in the gorge, and the ledger is ash." "Why?" "Because I'm exhausted." The admission hung in the hot air, shockingly vulnerable, coming from a man wearing an executioner's mask. "I've been running Coffee's errands for 12 years, the preacher said. "Burning out homesteaders. Intimidating witnesses. Digging the holes. I'm tired of the blood. I'm tired of the judge's endless sermons on civic duty while he robs the territory blind." The preacher sat back. "I want to be done. I want to ride out to a coast where nobody recognizes my face. But I can't leave as long as that ledger exists. It's a chain around Coffee's neck, and it's a chain around mine. Hand it over. I'll burn it myself right here. You can watch the smoke." "Don't do it," Maria said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the canyon like a razor. The preacher looked down at her. "You don't have a seat at this table, girl. You're breathing because he's leveraging you." "My father is dead because of you," she shot back, stepping forward. "Because of Coffee. Because of the names in that book." The preacher was quiet. The 4 riders on the rim glanced uneasily at one another. "Your father," the preacher finally said. "Salt River claim. I remember him." The preacher reached up, gripping the fabric of the flour sack, and ripped the hood off. The face underneath wasn't a monster. It was a deeply lined, heavily weathered cowboy with intelligent gray eyes and a shock of salt and pepper hair. The jagged white scar cut a savage diagonal across an otherwise unremarkable, handsome face. He looked like a man who should be mending fences, not enforcing corporate murder. "My name is Isaac Heston," he said quietly. "I ran a farm in Missouri. Had a wife. A daughter. A man with a badge and a bankroll decided he wanted my acreage. I fought. I lost it all. He locked his gray eyes on Good. I know the exact weight of what you're hauling in that bag. I've been carrying it for a decade. Hand it to me. Let me incinerate it. Let us both walk away clean. Good looked at the heavy saddlebag. He looked at Maria, her fists clenched so tight her knuckles were bone white. He pulled the ledger from the bag. The preacher exhaled a long, visible breath. The riders on the rim relaxed their grips on their rifles. Good held the book up by its torn spine. 47 names, Good said. Your name is in the index, along with every farm you burned and every man you buried. I know the contents, Isaac said, his jaw tightening. Burning the paper doesn't unburn the farms. You want to walk away clean. There is no clean. You're the judge's dog, and you've been biting people for 12 years. Good extended his arm and opened his fingers. The ledger dropped. It hit the gravel hard. The damaged binding ruptured entirely. 47 pages of meticulous, damning evidence spilled out, scattering like dead leaves across the canyon floor. The preacher stared at the mess of paper. There it is, Good said, dropping his hand to hover over the Colt. Come down and strike the match. Isaac Heston's face went completely bloodless under his deep tan. His hand drifted toward the revolver strapped to his hip. You think I won't ride down there? Isaac demanded, his voice cracking. I think you're tired, Good said. I think you want the nightmare to end. But you know picking up that paper just makes you Coffee's errand boy one last time. Isaac stared at the scattered pages. The wind caught one, flipping it over to reveal the pristine dark ink. If you ride out of here with those names, Isaac whispered, Coffee sends the Pinkertons. He sends the federal trackers. They won't stop until you're gutted. Then come down and stop me yourself. Isaac's hand shook violently as it hovered over his gun butt. The internal war raged across his features, the desire to survive fighting the crushing, inescapable exhaustion of a compromised soul. Let me burn it, Isaac pleaded. Please. Maria stepped forward, walking directly into the center of the scattered documents. She bent down, her fingers searching through the loose vellum. She found the sheet she was looking for. Page 37. She stood up, holding the paper high above her head so the man on the rim could clearly see the ink. This is my father, she yelled, her voice echoing fiercely off the rock. This is what his life cost. $1,200 to a corrupt badge. She glared at Isaac. You want to burn the rest? Burn it. But I'm keeping this. And I'm going to walk to Tucson. And I'm going to hand this page to a federal marshal. I'm going to tell him about the congregation. I'm going to tell him about Judge Coffee. And I'm going to give him the name Isaac Heston. She folded the heavy parchment twice and shoved it deep into the pocket of her torn dress. Now come down here and take it from me, she challenged. Isaac stared at the young woman standing in the dirt. He stared at her like she was a ghost he had tried very hard to leave in Missouri. The trembling in his hand stopped. He slowly, deliberately pulled his hand away from his revolver. One of the riders on the rim shifted his horse nervously. Isaac, what the hell are you doing? Shut your mouth, Isaac said, his voice dead and flat. He looked at Good. Take the gray, Isaac said. He's got better stamina than the bay. He yanked the reins, turning his horse away from the canyon rim. Isaac, the rider yelled. Isaac ignored him. He rode west, his silhouette disappearing over the ridge line. He didn't look back. The 4 remaining posse members sat in stunned silence. They looked down at the scattered ledger, then at the man holding the Colt, and finally at the retreating dust of their commander. Without a word, the closest rider wheeled his mount and rode east, heading back to Redemption. The others exchanged a bleak look and followed suit, abandoning the canyon entirely. Good stood in the silence of the gorge, listening to the fading hoofbeats. He knelt in the dirt, methodically gathering the scattered pages of Ezra's life's work. He stacked them neatly, pressing them back into the ruined leather binder, and shoved the entire package into the saddlebag. Maria watched him. The fire had drained out of her, leaving her looking small and impossibly tired. "Is he coming back?" she asked. "No," Good said, securing the saddlebag on the gray stallion. "He's riding until he hits an ocean." He gathered the reins and led the massive horse over to her. "Mount up." She grabbed the horn, pulling herself into the saddle. She looked down at him, clutching the fabric of her pocket where page 37 sat. "He killed my father," she said softly. "But he let us walk." "A man isn't always one thing or the other," Good said. He picked up the lead rope. The sun had crested the western ridge, casting the canyon into deep cooling shadow. "Where are we going?" she asked. Good looked at the trail leading out of the gorge, tracing the route the posse had taken back to the flats. "Back toward Redemption. We're going to finish the accounting." Chapter 5. The residual adrenaline from the canyon standoff burned out of Good's system within an hour, replaced by a profound cellular exhaustion that made his bones feel like they were cast from lead. He walked the trail on foot, leading the massive gray stallion by the leather reins. Maria rode in the saddle, wrapped in a heavy canvas duster he had pulled from the preacher's bedroll. The oversized Stetson shielded her face, casting her expression in deep shadow. They didn't speak. The sheer mechanical effort of placing one boot in front of the other consumed all available energy. The topography gradually leveled out, the jagged limestone funnels giving way to a sprawling, undulating sea of high desert scrub. To the west, the jagged spine of the mountains punched a black, ragged line against the canopy of stars. That was the destination. The Federal Marshal in Tucson. 3 days of navigating hostile terrain with a target painted directly on their backs. Good located a minor depression in the earth, nestled against the base of a massive, wind-sculpted boulder. The stone had spent 12 hours absorbing the brutal daytime radiation, and was now slowly radiating that stored heat back into the freezing night air. A thin, muddy seep trickled from a fissure near the base, barely enough to wet the gray's muzzle, but it was moisture. He halted the stallion. "Dismount," he said, his voice sandpaper rough. "We hold here until false dawn." Maria swung her leg over the cantle, sliding to the dirt. Her knees immediately buckled. Good caught her by the elbow, taking her weight before she hit the ground. She felt terribly fragile through the heavy canvas, but the core of her remained rigid with defiance. She steadied herself, stepping away from his grip. "I can take the first watch." Good unbuckled his gun belt. The heavy Colt dragged at his hip. "You know how to stand a post." "My father taught me the mechanics," she said, her tone completely devoid of sentiment. When the congregation started running off the neighboring claims, "He taught me to listen to the spaces between the wind." Good handed her the holstered Colt. She took it, her bruised, torn fingers wrapping awkwardly around the thick leather rig. She didn't complain about the weight. "Keep your thumb off the hammer until you intend to squeeze the trigger," Good advised, lowering himself onto the dirt against the warm face of the boulder. "If you see a silhouette, don't ask for a name. Just wake me." She sat on a flat shelf of rock facing the eastern trail, laying the heavy revolver across her lap. "Get some sleep, cowboy." Good closed his eyes. The ambient warmth of the boulder soaked into his spine, fighting the deep desert chill. He fully expected his fractured nervous system to keep him awake, scanning the darkness for the inevitable arrival of Elias Coffey's butchers. Instead, he dropped into a black, dreamless void like a stone tossed down a well. A sharp pressure on his bicep snapped him back to consciousness. Good's eyes opened. The desert remained locked in pitch blackness, the stars burning with a cold, indifferent intensity. Maria's hand clamped hard on his arm. She didn't speak. She just pointed toward the high ridge line, tracking a mile to the east. A single, yellowish point of light drifted along the crest of the rock. A kerosene lantern. Good shifted his weight, coming up onto one knee. He took the Colt from Maria's lap, thumbing the hammer back with a soft, metallic double click. The lantern moved with predatory calculation. It didn't bounce with the erratic gait of a man simply traveling. It swept the terrain in methodical, geometric arcs. Someone was actively cutting for sign, dragging the high ground to spot any disruption in the landscape below. The light ceased its sweeping motion. It froze directly at the apex of the ridge. The scout had spotted the massive gray stallion standing near the boulder. Good held his breath, leveling the heavy revolver in the dark, calculating the bullet drop over a mile of empty air. The shot was an impossibility, but the gesture anchored him. They waited for the scout to signal, to fire a flare, or fire a rifle, or begin the slow, inevitable descent into the depression to finish the contract. Instead, the lantern simply extinguished. The ridgeline plunged back into absolute darkness. Good knelt in the dirt for an hour, the heavy Colt beginning to tremble in his fatigued grip. The wind hissed through the scrub. The gray stallion shifted its weight, snapping a dry twig. But the darkness on the ridge remained unbroken. Nobody came down the slope. "They found us," Maria whispered, the words barely carrying over the wind. "A lone scout," Good corrected. "Why didn't he shoot?" "Because he's out of range, and he knows we have the high-caliber hardware. He's a spotter, not an executioner." Good eased the hammer down and slid the weapon back into its holster. He confirmed our trajectory. Now he's riding back to inform the payroll. By the time the sky bruised into a dull, metallic gray, Good had hiked halfway up the eastern incline to investigate the perimeter. He found the hoofprints pressed deep into the shale near the crest. A single rider. The tracking was unmistakable. The horse had paced back and forth, holding its position while the rider evaluated the camp below, before pivoting sharply on its hind legs and galloping eastward at top speed. Back toward the town of Redemption. Back to Elias Coffey. Good returned to the camp. Maria had already tightened the cinch on the gray's saddle. She looked at him, reading the confirmation on his face. "How much of a lead do we have?" she asked. "He burned 3 hours watching us, plus the ride back. Coffey knows exactly where we are on the map." Good checked the saddlebag, ensuring the heavy leather ledger remained secure. "We need to put 20 miles of hardpack behind us before the sun peaks." They resumed the brutal march westward. The desert floor offered a deceivingly flat expanse, interrupted by sudden violent scars of erosion. The temperature climbed rapidly, transforming the morning chill into a suffocating, atmospheric pressure that made drawing a full breath an act of labor. By mid-morning, the Blue Mountains marking the perimeter of Tucson finally began to resolve from a hazy suggestion into a jagged, physical reality on the horizon. Good paused to wipe a thick sheen of grit and sweat from his eyes. When he lowered his hand, he saw the weather event forming in the south. It wasn't a dust devil. It was a massive, localized storm of pulverized caliche, rising hundreds of feet into the stagnant air. The beige cloud rolled aggressively across the plain, moving perpendicular to their path. Good yanked the reins, dragging the gray stallion into the sparse cover of a mesquite thicket. He pulled Maria down from the saddle, crouching in the thorny brush. The low, percussive rumble of a cavalry charge vibrated through the soles of his boots. The posse broke over the southern rise. Not 5 men. Not 10. A solid wall of 20 riders charged across the basin, their horses lathered and driven to the absolute edge of cardiovascular failure. The men rode with Winchesters drawn, their faces wrapped in bandanas against the choking dust of their own creation. It was the entire muscle of redemption, heavily armed and riding with the singular frantic purpose of men protecting their own survival. Good kept his hand clamped over the gray's muzzle. The horse trembled, smelling the sweat and panic of the passing herd. The riders didn't angle toward Good's position. They didn't slow down to cut for sign or check the arroyos. They possessed a specific coordinate and a brutal deadline. They thundered past the thicket, a half-mile away, their unified gallop shaking the limestone beneath the dirt. Within 5 minutes, they had crested the western ridge and vanished, leaving behind a lingering, suffocating cloud of dust that tasted like chalk. Good released the horse's muzzle. Maria slowly stood up, her eyes tracking the dissipating dust cloud. Her torn hands gripped the fabric of the canvas duster. "They didn't stop," she said, her voice laced with sudden, terrifying realization. "They know exactly where we are, but they didn't stop." Good watched the trail they had left. "They aren't hunting us anymore." "I don't understand." Coffee looked at the map. He realized he couldn't guarantee catching us in this broken terrain. Too many ravines, too many places to vanish. Good pointed toward the western horizon, where the posse had disappeared. "So he's not chasing the rabbit. He's plugging the hole." Maria stared at the blue mountains. Tucson. "They're bypassing us to set an anvil on the main road. The only pass through those mountains is a bottleneck. By tonight, Coffee will have 20 rifles dug into the high ground overlooking that trail. If we ride through that canyon, they'll turn us into pink mist from 500 yards away." The gravity of the tactical situation settled over them like a weighted blanket. The sprawling, empty desert suddenly felt claustrophobic. They were boxed in. A firing squad waiting at the finish line, and an unforgiving wasteland in every other direction. "What's the play?" she asked. She didn't panic. Her father's murder had burned the panic out of her system, leaving only cold utility. Good unslung the heavy saddlebag. He flipped the leather flap, staring at the ruined binding of the ledger. The names. The transactions. The bloody mathematics of an entire territory. "Coffee is a man who operates on logic and predictable outcomes," Good said, his voice dropping into a flat, analytical cadence. "He expects us to run. He expects us to try and slip the net. He committed his entire defensive line to that assumption." He looked back toward the east, toward the empty horizon they had just spent 2 days agonizingly putting behind them. "So we break the pattern." Maria followed his gaze. Her eyes widened slightly, the implications clicking into place. "You're out of your mind. We can't go west. They'll slaughter us in the pass. We can't go north or south. There's no water for 100 miles. The only empty space on the board is the space they just vacated." "Redemption," she whispered. "You want to walk back into the meat grinder." Coffee is sitting in that town, practically alone. He deployed his muscle to the perimeter. He thinks he's the spider in the center of the web. Good pulled the ledger completely out of the bag. The pages felt thick and greasy in his hands. "We walk through his front door. We put this book on his desk. And we tell him the game is over. He'll shoot you where you stand." Not if he thinks he's holding a worthless piece of paper. Good looked at her, his eyes locking onto hers. You still have the page. Maria reached into the torn pocket of her dress, her fingers brushing the heavy parchment she had retrieved from the canyon floor. Page 37. The receipt for her father's execution. I have it. Coffee knows we have the book. But he doesn't know what we've done with it while we were out here. We walk in, we hand him the ledger, and we inform him that a duplicate transcript of the most damaging pages is already in the hands of a courier riding a separate route to the capital. A bluff, she said. A dead man's switch, Good corrected. We tell him that if we don't ride out of redemption unmolested, that courier delivers the copy to the governor. He can burn the original book all he wants. The leverage remains. She stared at him, the bruised lines around her mouth tightening. And if he calls the bluff? Good slid the ledger back into the bag and hoisted it onto his shoulder. Then I put a .45 caliber hole in his chest, and we see how the town votes on the new management. Maria looked toward the western mountains, where salvation had been waiting, now fortified by 20 hired guns. Then she looked back to the east, toward the blistering expanse of hardpan leading back to the corrupt heart of the territory. She reached up, adjusting the brim of the oversized Stetson to block the harsh glare. It's a long walk, she said. I've made longer. Good took the leather reins of the gray stallion. He didn't mount up. He simply turned his back on the blue mountains and began the brutal, methodical trek eastward. Maria fell into step beside him. Her torn dress fluttered in the dry furnace wind. Her hands were bloodied, her face coated in chalky dust, but her stride was unbroken. She walked with the focused, terrifying momentum of a woman returning to the scene of a crime to ensure the architect didn't survive the architecture. They walked as the sun climbed to its agonizing zenith, baking the moisture from their skin and turning the landscape into a shimmering, distorted hallucination. They walked as the shadows finally began to lengthen, stretching like long, bruised fingers across the cracked earth. They walked until the distant, sun-bleached structures of redemption broke the horizon, rising from the desert floor like the bleached ribs of a massive dead animal. The town appeared entirely deserted. No horses hitched to the rails. No movement on the sweeping porches. The thoroughfare was a silent corridor of peeling paint and shadowed doorways. But at the far southern terminus of the street, the double batwing doors of the Last Chance Saloon were propped wide open. A single kerosene lamp burned on the mahogany bar, casting a pool of sickly yellow light across the shattered glass and splintered furniture remaining from the previous night's shootout. And seated alone in the center of that wreckage, occupying a high-backed wooden chair, was a massive silhouette. Waiting. Chapter 6. Redemption held its breath as they walked the center of the hardpack. The town possessed the eerie, suspended quality of a graveyard waiting for the undertaker. The setting sun had bled the color from the false fronts, leaving only stark silhouettes against a bruised, violet sky. Shutters remained drawn tight. No dogs barked. The dust stirred by the massive gray stallion's hooves hung low and heavy in the stagnant air. At the southern terminus of the street, the Last Chance Saloon gaped open like a missing tooth. Good halted at the base of the wooden steps. The interior was a disaster zone of splintered mahogany and shattered glass from the previous night's firefight. The single kerosene lamp burning on the ruined bar threw harsh, erratic shadows against the flocked wallpaper. Seated in the center of the wreckage, perfectly still, was Judge Elias Coffey. He didn't look like the architect of a sprawling criminal empire. Stripped of his armed perimeter, Coffey resembled a punctured bladder. His black broadcloth suit was hopelessly wrinkled, stained with ash and spilled liquor. The heavy pomade had failed, leaving his white hair hanging in damp, erratic strings across his forehead. His face was the color of old cement. Good unslung the heavy leather saddlebag, letting the strap slide through his fingers. Coffee's bloodshot eyes tracked the movement. He placed his soft, manicured hands flat on the scarred table in front of him, and slowly pushed himself upward. He walked to the threshold of the batwing doors, pausing where the yellow lamplight met the encroaching dark of the street. "You came back," Coffee said. The booming, theatrical courtroom baritone was gone, replaced by the hollow rasp of a man whose nerves were entirely frayed. Good rested his hand on the saddle horn of the gray. Slipped the net. Coffee's gaze drifted past Good, staring at the empty expanse of the northern trail. His mind visibly worked the tactical geometry. "My payroll," Coffee muttered, the realization draining the last vestige of color from his cheeks. "The men I deployed to the Tucson Pass." "Sitting on an empty canyon, waiting for a ghost," Good confirmed. Coffee looked at Maria. She stood beside the stallion, the oversized Stetson casting a harsh shadow over the upper half of her face. The heavy canvas duster swallowed her frame, but she stood completely rigid, anchoring herself to the dirt. "The page," Coffee said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The one you tore from the binding. Page 37. Maria reached into the torn pocket of her dress. Her knuckles were bruised and split, the dried blood dark against her pale skin. She extracted the heavy, wrinkled parchment. The ink documented her father's execution. $1,200 paid to a corrupt badge. She held it up, the paper snapping faintly in the evening wind. "My father," she said, her voice devoid of any tremor. "You signed the paper." Coffee gripped the doorframe, his knuckles turning white. He tried to summon the arrogant authority of the bench, but the posture fractured instantly. "I didn't pull a trigger," Coffee insisted, his chest heaving. "Isaac Heston killed your father. The sheriff accepted the compensation. I simply finalized the paperwork. That is the function of the judiciary. I process the reality on the ground." "You processed a murder," she countered flatly. "You bought his water rights with his blood." Coffee sneered, a desperate, ugly twisting of his features. "Your father squatted on a premium aquifer. I required it. I purchased it. The sheriff guaranteed the transition. That is the unvarnished mechanism of this territory. It's how the railroad was built. It's how the cities were founded." He shifted his glare to Good, pointing a trembling finger at the saddlebag. "You think you're holding a revolution in that leather bag. You think you're going to hand that to a federal marshal, and a jury of honest farmers is going to put a rope around my neck." Coffee let out a dry, rattling laugh. "The marshal in Tucson is an anomaly. One honest badge in a sea of compromised men. There are 47 names in that ledger. 47 men holding public office who will do absolutely anything to ensure that book never sees the interior of a courtroom." Coffee stepped off the porch, his polished boots hitting the dirt. He closed the distance, stopping 3 feet from Good. The man smelled powerfully of stale perspiration and raw fear. "You aren't fixing this valley," Coffee spat. "You're going to hand me that ledger. You're going to watch me incinerate it on the floor of my saloon. And then you are going to ride west and forget you ever heard the name Elias Coffee." Good didn't flinch. He reached into the saddlebag and pulled the heavy, ruined binder free. The torn spine flapped loosely. "You want it," Good said. "Hand it over." Good held it out. Coffee reached for the leather cover, his eyes wide with a desperate, starving intensity. Maria's hand blurred. She snatched the ledger from Good's grip, yanking it backward against her chest before Coffee's fingers could close around the binding. Coffee staggered forward, grabbing empty air. His head snapped toward her, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unhinged malice. "Give me the goddamn book," Coffee snarled. "No." Coffee's hands began to shake violently. The veneer of civilization completely evaporated. "You hand me that ledger right now, or I will." "You'll what?" Maria interrupted, stepping directly into his personal space. "Nail me to a saguaro. Burn me at the stake. You already killed my father. You already stole his acreage. You exhausted your leverage." She held the book tight against her canvas duster, lifting page 37 in her other hand. "This is the accounting," she said, her voice echoing off the silent buildings. $1,200. That's what his life cost your syndicate. I'm walking to Tucson. I'm handing this to the marshal. And when he reads it, I'm going to stand in the street and start reciting the names loudly enough for the whole territory to hear. Coffee stared at her. The absolute certainty in her eyes broke whatever was left of his sanity. The logic failed him. The bluff didn't matter anymore. He realized that even if he burned the book, the girl would remain a walking indictment. His hand darted under his ruined suit coat. It was a clumsy, panicked draw. The weapon was a double-barreled Remington Derringer, a polished belly gun designed for card tables, not gunfights. He leveled the twin bores at Maria's chest, his thumb struggling to haul back the heavy hammer. "I'll gut you right here," Coffee screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "I'll kill you both and burn the paper." He never pulled the trigger. The sharp, concussive crack of a heavy-caliber rifle shattered the evening silence. A .44-40 slug tore through the empty air inches from Coffee's wrist, burying itself deep into the wooden post of the saloon awning. The violent kinetic shockwave snapped against Coffee's hand, causing his fingers to spasm. The silver Derringer dropped into the dirt. Coffee stumbled backward, gripping his wrist, his eyes darting frantically toward the northern edge of town. Sitting on a muscular bay horse, 50 yards up the street, was Isaac Heston. The preacher wore a heavy canvas duster. The white executioner's hood was gone. He sat perfectly still in the saddle, the lever of his Winchester already worked, a fresh round chambered, the muzzle locked firmly on the center of Elias Coffee's chest. Coffee stared at the man he had created, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "Isaac," Coffee gasped. "Isaac, what are you doing?" The preacher didn't answer the judge. He shifted his gray eyes to good. "Put the girl on the horse," Isaac said. The grinding rasp was entirely gone from his voice. It sounded flat. "Dead. Take the ledger. Walk out." Coffee threw his hands up in a gesture of frantic supplication. "Isaac, listen to me. Whatever he told you by the spring—" "He didn't have to tell me anything," Isaac interrupted, his voice carrying effortlessly down the empty street. "I came back to see how you'd handled the loss. I wanted to see if there was a shred of a man left beneath all the paperwork." Isaac lowered the rifle a fraction of an inch. "There's nothing left. You're an empty suit." Coffee's composure liquefied. He fell to his knees in the dirt, the dust coating his expensive trousers. "Isaac, I built you. I pulled you off a dead farm in Missouri. I gave you a purpose. I gave you authority." "You handed me a flour sack and a rope," Isaac corrected quietly. "You gave me 12 years of executing people who were in your way." Isaac looked back at Good. "Move," Isaac ordered. Good turned. He took the ledger from Maria and slid it securely into the saddlebag. He grabbed the gray's reins and took her arm, leading her southward, Past the saloon, past the kneeling judge, toward the open desert trail. Coffee's voice spiked into a hysterical, high-pitched shriek. Isaac, put the rifle away. We can fix this. I have cash reserves in Phoenix. I can deed you 5,000 acres. Whatever you want, just put the gun down. Good and Maria didn't break their stride. They passed the blackened, scorched pole where the effigy had burned the night before. The open desert lay ahead, an ocean of black scrub beneath a canopy of sharp, indifferent stars. Behind them, a single rifle shot rang out. Good stopped. He didn't draw the Colt. He just turned his head. Isaac Heston was still sitting the bay horse. The Winchester was smoking slightly in the cool air. Elias Coffey was sitting flat on his ass in the center of the street, clutching his chest. He was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. But there was no blood. Isaac had intentionally pulled the shot wide. He hadn't returned to execute the judge. He had returned to strip him. To leave Elias Coffey sitting in the dirt, unarmed, humiliated, and entirely powerless, waiting for the federal warrants to arrive. Isaac slid the Winchester into its leather scabbard. He didn't look at Coffey again. He wheeled the bay horse around and spurred it hard into a gallop, riding straight into the fading orange light of the western horizon. Good watched the dust settle in the street. Slowly, the town of Redemption began to wake up. Front doors cracked open. Shutters lifted. Men and women stepped out onto their porches, holding kerosene lamps, staring at the pathetic, weeping man sitting in the dirt where their untouchable judge used to be. The fear was gone. The illusion was broken. Good looked at Maria. The oversized hat shadowed her face, but he could see her shoulders finally drop, the impossible tension of the past 48 hours releasing its grip. "Can your legs handle the mileage?" Good asked. She looked at the long, dark trail stretching toward the mountains. Toward Tucson. "I can walk." They walked. The ambient light of the town faded behind them, swallowed by the sheer immensity of the desert night. The air turned biting and cold. The only sound was the rhythmic, comforting crunch of their boots, and the heavy, measured breathing of the gray stallion walking at their side. A mile out, Maria stopped. She unbuckled the saddlebag, pulled the heavy leather binder out, and flipped it open to page 37. She traced the 3 lines of ink detailing her father's death with her bruised index finger. Then she closed the book, slotting it securely back into the bag. She didn't tear the page out. She kept it bound with the others. The entire story. She looked up at Good, her dark eyes reflecting the starlight. "When we hand this over," she said quietly, "what happens if the marshal is just another name waiting for a price?" Good looked down the empty trail. The darkness was absolute, but the direction was set. "Then we keep walking," Good said. "We keep carrying the paper. We keep reciting the names. We tell the story in every town from here to the coast until somebody with a badge and a spine decides to make it right." She stared at him for a long moment. The hard, defensive shell she had worn since he cut her loose from the post finally cracked, revealing the profound, enduring resilience beneath. She reached out, her cold, bloodied fingers brushing the back of his hand. "My father had a terrible eye for real estate," she said softly. "But he was an excellent judge of character." Good looked at her in the dark. "He would have called you a good man," she finished. Good didn't answer. He adjusted the heavy colt on his hip, took the leather reins of the gray stallion, and stepped forward into the dark. Maria fell into step beside him. They walked, carrying the bloody accounting of an entire territory, disappearing into the vast, uncompromising silence of the western desert. The end.